welcome to those people joining us today for our Transition Lunch and Learn. We've got the numbers starting to tick up here. I can see those numbers coming in. So we'll give it a minute or so just to let people continue to join, and also to get I think we're going to be streaming on LinkedIn Live as well. So just to allow that all to be set up in the background and not start up halfway through. So I'll just give it, another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll kick off our Transition Finance Lunch and Learn for today. Over my right shoulder, my image is mirrored, you will find a QR code where you can find and download the report that my esteemed colleague Peter will be talking about today. I'll just give it another 30 seconds or so while people continue to join. Those numbers are starting or continuing to tick up. Right, so welcome everybody to Climate Bonds Lunch and Learn, Transition Finance Lunch and Learn. We're doing these on a fairly regular basis now. This is our second public lunch and learn. We were doing them on a much smaller basis for quite a long time, but we decided to share the knowledge and share the wealth, and we went public with this a little while ago. So I am joined today by the Director of Fixed Income, Head of Food and Land Programme at Planet Tracker, Peter Elwin.
Hi.
And he will be talking a little bit today about the materiality of nutrition and the role of markets in the financial sector in delivering nutritious food. So I'll just talk, I don't know much about nutrition, so I'm hoping to learn a lot today. We do know, all of us who work in the environment and work in climate change related industries, most of us know that we need to start changing our diets. We know that our diets are responsible for huge amounts of deforestation and land use change, pollution, water pollution, as well as direct emissions of greenhouse gases. But what is the intersection with nutrition and healthy food on this? So this is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. And I'm going to start off with a question for you, Peter, before we dive in. What do you mean by healthy food?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rachel, and it's always important in these sort of contexts to really, start with some sort of definition. So in this particular context, we were working with the Access to Nutrition Initiative, using their data and sort of basing our work on their methodology. And they've done a lot of work on sort of how to define healthy food. And there are various nutrition profiling sort of models that are available that academics have developed, that look at the ingredients going into a particular food product and sort of essentially establishing a score for sort of, if you like, the good things that are in it and the bad things. And the ATNI has done a lot of work on sort of assessing these models. And the one that they've plumped for is the Health Star rating system, which was originally developed by the Australian government, some of the Australian states, and also in collaboration with sort of companies in Australia. So sort of Australian founded, but is now internationally recognized. And the Health Star rating system essentially takes each ingredient in a food product, scores it from sort of 0.5 at the worst end up to 5 out of 5 at the best, and then aggregates those scores to come up with a score for a sticky bun or a soft drink or a dairy product or something like that. So you can have an HSR, a Health Star rating score for a particular food product. And then obviously what the Access to Nutrition Initiative has done is aggregated those food product scores across the whole portfolio that a particular company is producing. So you can actually then score the company or the company's product portfolio using that HSR methodology as well. So that's the one we've used as they sort of say on the BBC or whatever, you know, it's not the only one available. There are other models. The UK itself actually has a UK version of sort of health star rating. But they're all fundamentally trying to do the same sort of thing, which is to assess the different components within a food product and say, overall, is it really healthy? It's probably worth just mentioning at this point, and this may also come up in the Q&A as well at the end, that what we were not looking at was the degree of processing. So there's obviously a lot of conversations around at the moment about ultra processed food, and the system that was originally developed by sort of Brazilian academics called the NOVA system, where you can classify food into 4 different buckets according to the level of processing that has actually been sort of undertaken to produce the food product, with ultra processed as the sort of the top or the most extreme bucket. We were not looking at the degree of processing that went into the food, partly because that's a little bit more of a judgmental framework. It's not quite so easy to quantify, whereas the health star rating is much more based on sort of, if you like, scientific analysis of the individual components. So long answer, but health star rating is the short answer.
Well, that's super interesting, and thank you for that. So just to give a little bit of background, at Climate Bonds Initiative, we have a transition program that is looking to define the pathways to net zero for various sectors, and agriculture is one of them. So with the agricultural sector, we're looking at crop production, livestock production, deforestation-free commodity sourcing, the food value chain, alternative proteins, but we look at it very much from the point of view of the environmental impacts. The nutritional aspect is somewhat of an addition and a safeguard, but it's not the primary focus. So I'm the head of the transition program, and I'm really interested to learn about what you're talking about today, materiality of nutrition to financial markets. And I do have an additional, possibly slightly tricky question for you. So I can see on this beautiful introductory slide, there is some fish.
Mm.
There has been some research, and there's been increasing concerns in some scientific circles about the nutritional value of fish as it exists at the moment, not in a kind of clean and pure form as it exists prior to, let's say, the Industrial Revolution, but because of the amount of pollutants going into our freshwater and our ocean systems. Would fish, for example, be considered a healthy food in this health star rating system?
Yes, that's a good question, and yes, it would, because the health star rating system is essentially scoring foods on the basis of a pure version, if you like. So, you know, bottled water, for example, would score a 5 as being very, very healthy. But of course, if you bottled water from an impure source, then it could ultimately be toxic. And the HSR rating system doesn't sort of account for that. So there's a sort of a healthy food by definition, and then there's healthy food in terms of actual practice. And that's where you need your health inspector to go around to the restaurant and say, well, you're mixing healthy food together, but then you're letting the rats crawl all over it. And actually, it's really horrible. So your point, I think, is a really good one. And this is one of the challenges from a broad food system perspective, that, of course, the things that we're doing to the planet feed back into the food system, both in terms of climate change, making sort of food products harder to produce, but also the pollution that the food system itself throws off, and things like plastics, which are used in sort of growing food and then packaging it, all getting cycled around and ultimately ending up in the food that we're eating, and obviously then ending up in us. And the forever chemicals, PFAS, would be another example of the same sort of pollution cycle. So yeah, it's a really good question. Unfortunately, health star rating is a sort of almost like a theoretical model, if you like. If you really want to know quite how good for you a particular food product actually is, you'd need to test it, which is where organic food obviously has quite a lot of attractions, because at least the farmer there is not inputting a lot of chemicals into the food product. But fish, challenge there, it can say it's wild caught, sounds wonderful, but it might be full of mercury or other unfortunate chemicals, just because that's what's in the ocean.
Exactly. So, for everybody who has joined, thank you very much for your time. Peter is going to talk us through his most recent report. And there will be plenty of time for any questions at the end. So please do feel free to throw your questions as we're going through this presentation in that Q&A box, and I'll make sure that we get to them at the end of the report. But just no need to wait till the end to ask the question. Just put it in the Q&A box and we'll get to it once Peter's done. So with that, over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks for having me on this Lunch and Learn. And I hope the topic is not going to be too off-putting to those of you who may actually be eating your lunch during the session. I should also say a couple of things. One is Rachel was sort of mentioning, the food system's fundamental inefficiencies around things like meat production. We use about 80% of our agricultural land to produce under 20% of our calories when it comes to meat production. We're not going to be talking in this report. It doesn't address some of those sort of dietary factors that impact the way that we use land. I'm very happy to sort of discuss that at the end of the presentation if that's a topic of interest. But what we were focusing on in this report was very specifically, as Rachel and I were really just discussing, the ingredients in particular food products and the way that those food products are then sort of packaged together by particular food manufacturing companies. So without further ado, so there's a nice picture of me, and that's a reminder of who I am, Director of Fixed Income and Head of the Food and Land Use Programme at Planet Tracker. Planet Tracker, for those of you who don't know us, we are a non-profit, sustainable finance-focused think tank, and we produce research and other tools for investors, for financial institutions, to enable them to understand the risks that are associated with unsustainable practices and to help them to identify the opportunities associated with funding, with financing, the good things, doing the right thing from a planetary perspective. So this particular report, as I was discussing earlier, we produced it in conjunction with the Access to Nutrition Initiative. We took their database and they, every couple of years, they produce an index, a survey of 25 food production companies looking at the aggregate scores of their food portfolios. So they add up their coffee and their dairy products and their sticky buns and their sort of soup and all the rest of it, add up all those scores, and they come up with an overall aggregate score for the company, which not only captures the health of the food product portfolio, but also the way the company is actually behaving in relation to the food environment. So it's a pretty holistic and comprehensive analysis done by the Access to Nutrition Initiative, and it's essentially the sort of the core database that is available for investors and for other people to look at this particular issue. Having said that, we wanted to zero in very much on the nutritional aspects. So we sort of picked out a core element of their database to answer the basic question, is health wealth? In other words, is producing healthy food more profitable? Or, as I suspect that many of us would guess, is it actually more profitable to make sort of bucket loads of really bad food because you're not paying much for the ingredients and you're selling them at a very high price to lots and lots of people? They're consuming enormous quantities of it, and you're then going to make a lot of money. Which of those two things turns out to be the case? We looked at 20 companies out of the 25 covered by ATNI's global index. We picked 20 because they were the public companies. We could get the most information about them, and we could get market valuations as well. So that sort of narrowed the sample down, but that still left us with a group of companies that have revenues of 6.63 trillion in 2022, 10% of the global food and beverage market, which is pretty sort of impressive number. Now the sample limitations, obviously 20 companies is a small size, and although we found some sort of relationships, correlation doesn't prove causation. So I think one needs to be a little bit careful about sort of interpreting the results that we've got, but I still think they're particularly interesting and certainly worthy of sort of further thought and investigation. Now, I have to be honest, when I first ran through the data set, looked at all the companies as a block, really we found sort of no obvious relationship between health and profitability. So that was slightly depressing. Then what we decided to do was to see if we could compare companies on a more close sort of like-for-like basis. So we actually segregated our universe according to size. So we divided companies up between sort of size, so 75 billion for larger ones, below that threshold for the smaller ones. We then also looked at them on a range of food products they produce. So if they just focused on a few food products, so they were essentially just a dairy company, for example, then that would be a narrow food portfolio, less than 5 food categories. If they did lots and lots of different things, soup to nuts, as it were, and all the things in between, then they would be classified as a broader food portfolio. So you've got the size of the company and the breadth of the food portfolio as the two sort of key axes. And then, of course, we could also divide into healthy and unhealthy. Now, I have to just pause here for a moment. We've labeled these as unhealthy, which is a health star rating score of 2.3 or below, and then healthier, 2.5 and above. And we've said healthier rather than healthy because actually the definition of healthy is 3.5. And it's worth just pausing for a moment to recognize that only one company out of the 25 in the ATNI index actually has an aggregate score of 3.5. And that company last time was Danone. So all of the other companies in their index on broad terms score as unhealthy. So we're dividing the very unhealthy between the sort of with the slightly less unhealthy, but we've called it healthier for ease of reference. So having divided up our sample, and of course, that's also worth being honest here, that made the sample sizes of each particular bucket even smaller. So very much sort of, be cautious about interpreting the results to too strong an extent. But having done that, we could then start burrowing into the data. And one of the key things that we found was that companies with broader food portfolios that were smaller and were focused on healthier food products were more profitable than their peers. So that seemed a fairly clear finding, and it stood the test of time as well. As you can see from the top right-hand side, that EBIT margin was higher across time, 2013 through to 2022, which was the same period covered by the Access to Nutrition Initiative data. We looked at financials as well, and that relationship stands the test of time all the way across. And you can see on the left-hand side, the margins consistently ahead for healthier companies. Now, the healthier companies on the left-hand side, you can see there's a large, broad, healthier with a little number in brackets, and number one, that tells you there's actually only one company in that particular bucket and one company in the large, broad, unhealthy bucket as well. So you're really not comparing a universe with a universe, it's one company against one company. And lo and behold, when you look at the right-hand chart at the bottom, you can see that their margins, the two companies, are sort of fluctuating one above the other. So one year, one company's ahead, and then the next year, another company is ahead. And actually, those two companies, the larger, broader, healthier one is Nestle, healthier in 2022, and the unhealthier one is Unilever. But as you can see from the time chart, that relationship has switched over time. So relationship not really very clear when you look at big companies, but when you're looking at smaller ones, and they're still pretty big, 75 billion, thank you very much. When you're looking at smaller companies, that relationship seemed pretty clear. So health is equating to wealth in that particular group. However, when you look at companies with narrower food portfolios, so they're just focused on a few food products, then there was a very clear opposite relationship that unhealthy was more profitable. Now, typically, a lot of these companies are focused on soft drinks. So this is where Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, they all sit in this particular group. And you can see that whether you're looking at sort of small or large, you're getting really very high EBIT margins, higher than their peer group. Now, if you look carefully at the chart at the top, you'll see that there are no large, narrow, healthy companies, and that's because there were none in our sample. So all the large companies are producing really very unhealthy products. In the small group, there were some producing healthy products, 6 in fact in our universe, but they weren't as profitable as their unhealthy compatriots. And that relationship holds consistently across time, as you can see from the bottom chart. So that's the sort of the bad news in terms of what we found. So if you're doing a lot of different food products, healthy is the way to go. But if you really want to focus on just producing a few, then you might as well make them as unhealthy as you possibly can, because you'll make a lot of money out of doing that. Now, of course, having said that, these are the companies that are then going to be most exposed to risk from regulation. And it's worth just sort of pausing at this point to sort of step back and take that broader view that Rachel was sort of alluding to before I started chatting through the slides. When you think about the impact of unhealthy food on the population at large, it's very, very serious. Something like 1/5, 20% of the deaths globally are attributable to dietary factors. 1/5. And that's obesity, obviously, also malnutrition, so not getting enough, but obesity and those sorts of diseases, non-communicable diseases driven by that, are really serious sort of killers and disablers. And it's not just in the sort of the Western world. You might typically think of a sort of, a fat Western European sort of person or somebody from North America eating too many sort of Cheetos and cheeseburgers and all the rest of it. But this is a problem across Latin America. It's a problem across sub-Saharan Africa. It's a problem in Asia as well. It's a problem across lower and middle income countries as well as higher income countries. And so you can have this terrible effect where part of the population in a lower or middle income country is actually starving. They are malnourished through lack of food. But there's another chunk of the population who are actually suffering dietary disease as a result of being given too much of the wrong sort of food. And they're suffering obesity and overweight and all the consequences of that. So there's a very serious global health problem coming from unhealthy food. Regulation is the only real answer to that from a state perspective. And these companies with narrow, very unhealthy product portfolios and high margins are therefore right in the sights of the regulators.
Peter, I've got a question. I'm really sorry for jumping in here, but it's an interesting subject. You mentioned a couple of the health impacts of unhealthy food, diabetes, overweight. Now, there's a lot of studies that we reference in our work looking at the link between diseases like cancer and the consumption of red meat, for example. Now, the reason obviously we're interested in that is because red meat has, as you alluded to earlier, an incredibly high climate and environment impact compared to the amount of calories, for example, that it provides. The star ratings, is this the health score and the star ratings, does that account for the health impact, or is it looking primarily at things like as sugar and salt?
Yes, that's a good question. And I must confess, I don't actually know the real detailed answer to that. It is looking primarily at things like sort of sugar and salt and fiber and those sorts of core ingredients in the food product. So yes, I don't know how well a sort of a steak would score on an HSR sort of scale. So yeah, I'd have to get back to you on that. It's a good question. I think it would probably score quite well because it's sort of high in protein. It's got some sort of, good chemicals in it like iron, a certain amount of fiber, and obviously no sugar. And depending upon how you've then cooked it, it may have some salt or whatever. But the health star rating is really looking at sort of prepared food rather than sort of things like sort of steak. So it very much depends on what you then do with it. If you put it into a burger, then obviously the rating could go down quite a lot because then there's a lot more fat included in it. So yeah, I think it would vary. But in simple terms, the sort of purer, simpler food is likely to score a bit better than food that has had lots of other things added to it. So yes, it doesn't really take into account in the way that you were sort of suggesting the sort of impact in the long term if you consume too much red meat. It's not assessing the impact if you overdo a particular food type, I guess is another way of putting it.
Okay, so it's simply that the food is bad in a short space of time and wouldn't necessarily look. That's an interesting one. I'll come back to this at the end because I'm really
I think it's a really interesting point to think about. But yeah, I guess the simple way of thinking of the HSR system is that it really is, it's taking your yogurt drink and it's taking it into the lab and then dividing it up in its constituent bits and saying, right, it's got lots of this stuff and not much of that. what's the score for each of those components, add it all up again, that's the score for the yogurt drink. It's not then saying it's designed to make you drink lots and lots of these yogurt drinks and sort of turn into a yogurt-shaped blob. So talking of, we then looked at, having looked at the margins, we then looked at the valuation side of things. So what we were really trying to say here is, to what extent is the financial market sort of seeing through what companies are doing and attributing some sort of valuation premium to healthy food product portfolios. Now, when we look at enterprise value to EBIT, which is a measure that sort of ignores a lot of the individualities of a business, if you like. It's ignoring the debt structure, it's ignoring tax. So it's much more of a sort of international comparable measure. There you can see the green bars, the healthy ones, across all the peer groups we were looking at. Health is coming out marginally ahead. So that looks pretty positive. That looks as though the market is rewarding healthy food product portfolios. However, in the interest of honesty and sort of academic sensibility, we then, of course, investigated other valuation methods and, lo and behold, found that it was much more of a sort of chaotic mess, to be honest. And if you look at the bottom chart there for price earnings ratios, which really are valuing the company on an all-in basis, so it's all its individual characteristics being captured by the market, you can see that really the opposite picture tends to show up there, that on an unhealthy, companies are ahead on a price earnings multiple across all of the peer groups. So sort of diametrically the opposite conclusion. So that really sort of says to us in overall terms, it's not clear that the market is either overvaluing or attributing a greater value to health, nor indeed is the market sort of attributing a greater value to unhealthy. It's quite sort of confused and confusing. The picture is really not at all clear. Now, one of the reasons for that potential sort of market confusion, or one of the reasons why the market might simply not be allocating much weight, if you like, to the health of the food product portfolio is because of the difficulty of getting the information. So one of the other things that we did in this study was we looked at how companies were discussing these issues in their annual reports and their sustainability reports. When we looked at annual report disclosures, we saw the main focus in the annual report, the main way these things were described was as an opportunity. So companies are talking about the fact consumer preferences are changing, there are more people eating sort of vegan foods, there are more people thinking about their health, so we're going to reconfigure our food portfolio to sort of exploit this opportunity, and it's all about future opportunity and obviously then future profit. And you can see about a third, 36%, were discussing it as a strategic opportunity, but also referring to some of the risks, the regulatory risks I was alluding to. But the large majority, 57%, so heading on towards 2/3, are only discussing it as a strategic opportunity. No conversation about risk at all, in spite of the fact that we've already got regulations in, for example, Chile and Mexico, around labelling. We've had the sugar tax in the UK and similar efforts in a number of other countries around the world. So there is evidence that regulation is already coming after unhealthy food, but 57% of these food manufacturing companies, it's their business, they're not talking about the risks at all. And 7% of them not talking about it from any perspective whatsoever. So they're not really addressing the issue. And when you look at how they're talking about it on the right-hand side, there's a small minority of companies that report their health star rating score and set targets around it. So actually say, we are going to try to achieve an HSR sort of score of X by this date. But that's a tiny minority. A few more report their HSR score. A few different companies are setting targets, but not reporting HSR. One or two other companies, again, just to sort of give you the extra color, they're reporting some other sort of health metric, but it's their own homemade one, not a sort of internationally recognized one. But then the vast majority, 64%, are not doing anything about this at all. So they're not reporting the healthiness of their portfolios, and they're not talking about sort of any sort of ambition to improve it. So the level of conversation coming from the company, the level of information coming from the companies is really pretty poor. And when you look at how they're talking about it on earnings calls, again, very, very poor. So you can see there 60% of the earnings calls we looked across a sort of 4 or 5 year time frame, no mention by either the company or the investor. There were a few calls, a third of the calls, where one or the other made a mention. And when I say a mention, it was literally sort of 1 or 2 sentences. So very, very little attention being paid on earnings calls. Now, again, it's probably worth just adding the comment that an earnings call is really designed to discuss the recent results of the company and to talk about the next sort of, the near-term plans of the company. It's not really a forum for sort of detailed strategic discussions or perhaps broader questions. So there's, to an extent, you can understand why nutrition might not be coming up. But again, given the regulatory thrust, given the fact that this is a core component of what these companies actually do, we felt it was still pretty surprising that 60% of the calls did not mention the issue whatsoever. So what can we conclude from this? Well, nutrition is a material issue, certainly from a societal perspective. It's driving up health costs by a very great extent. That will drive up taxes, and the logical response will be regulation, because that's the way the state can save itself money, is to force companies to encourage its citizens to be healthier. Employers themselves are suffering these costs as well. They have to recruit from the employee base they've got within a particular country. If the whole country is trending towards overweight and obese, then that's the recruitment pool they're fishing in, and they've then got to deal with the consequences for their employees in terms of their employees' health and productivity. So there is an implicit cost on sort of the economy as a whole from the private sector perspective. We can see that companies are making high margins from selling unhealthy products, but those are the products that are most at risk. Sugar tax, it hits sugary drinks. What do companies do? They switch to sort of non-sugar alternatives, but potentially there are health risks associated with those as well. And again, the regulation will sort of come after them at some stage. It also seems to be clear that selling a broad range of healthier products is a profitable strategy. So again, when you're looking from a regulatory perspective, a regulator can say, you're selling unhealthy products, you're making a lot of money, you can afford to take a regulatory hit, and you have a strategic choice to diversify your food portfolio and make more money and avoid the penalty of regulation. So it's quite a positive story from a regulatory perspective, I think. The other challenge that we've obviously revealed is that poor disclosures are really preventing proper analysis. And it's perhaps no surprise that financial markets are not strongly attributing value either to health or to lack of health, because they really just don't have the detailed information that they actually need. Now, that's a challenge if you're trying to identify the companies that are really at risk from regulation in terms of the real specifics. You haven't got all the information you really need. It's also a challenge if you want to identify the companies that are really well placed to exploit the opportunities. So more disclosure is definitely a key ask as far as we're concerned. So we think investors have a really important role to play in influencing the direction of travel. They should be demanding better disclosures. They should be encouraging companies to set nutrition-related targets. And above all, they should be engaging with food companies and policymakers to help try to influence regulations so that it's sort of, if you like, economically positive as well as positive from a health perspective. And that really involves dialogue and collaboration. But of course, if the companies don't really help to drive that process forward, then the regulators will make up the rules without their input, and that will be pretty negative for the companies and therefore for financial institutions as well. I'll stop at that point. Very happy to take any questions that there may be.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting, and I learned an enormous amount because, like I said at the beginning, I don't know an enormous amount about nutrition. From what you said about the state of corporate disclosure at the moment on nutrition, it seems to me that there's some clear parallels with climate reporting and climate disclosures, particularly back a few years ago when there really weren't any standardized disclosures and everybody was doing the best that they could, reporting as best they knew how, but they were using different metrics. They were measuring different things. They were including different boundaries of the company to report on. Now we're seeing a lot of increased harmonization, increased standardization of those climate reporting metrics now, and with the kind of increasing acceptance of things like the ISSB reporting disclosures, the International Sustainability Standards Board reporting disclosures, and the kind of adoption of that task force and climate related financial disclosures, sorry, very long names, TCFD framework that came out a few years ago. There has been an increased standardization, and from that I think there has been a slow improvement in the quality of information that is available. It's still not as good as it needs to be because there's still quite a variety of metrics being used for investors. You mentioned at the beginning that there are a large number, or a number, of health rating systems in the world, and you chose one. What would be a recommendation based on this report to improve the disclosures? You said that the investors should be asking for better disclosures. How can they do that? How can, are these rating systems, we use the word interoperable quite often, things like sustainable finance taxonomy, so that they kind of talk to each other and interact. These nutrition rating systems, is there something similar? Is there one ring to guide them all, as it were,
Yes.
to help these investors?
Yeah, that's a good question, and no, I don't think so. I mean, the sort of international scoring system, the ones that are sort of, if you like, sort of academically recognized, they're all trying to do similar things. So they're all tending to look at, you know, the quantity of fiber, the quantity of salt, quantity of sugar, and those sorts of things within a food product. They don't necessarily score them all identically, but they will be scoring them in very similar ways. So if you were using the UK system to rate a product and you regard it as healthy, it's quite likely it would be healthy under the Health Star rating system as well. So you won't get much divergence, but you might get something scoring out of 10 and something scoring out of 5, or, you know, so there'll be different numbers, but the overall implication of the assessment would be pretty, would be the same. It would be, I mean, we used Health Star rating. That's the one the Access to Nutrition Initiative have used. They did a very comprehensive study of the rating systems that are available around the world, and that was the one they picked. So we certainly don't have better information than them, so I wouldn't want to sort of, you know, argue against their choice. And certainly, as I say, there are one or two companies that have decided to use the Health Star rating system themselves. Others have sort of made up their own. So HSR would seem like a very obvious candidate. But generally, I think it's, if companies are using a rating system which is sort of understandable, verifiable, produced by a third party, and therefore credible, that's a really important starting point. It would be ideal if they all just picked the same one, but I think we'll have to deal with a sort of VHS versus Betamax for the older people in the audience, and the sort of typewriter versus the quill pen sort of situation for a while before we get to, you know, the sort of result you were talking about. And I think the other thing that's worth just commenting on, I mean, you know, you mentioned climate sort of as a, you know, an area where we've now sort of coalesced around a common language and a reasonably coherent sort of set of disclosures. Clearly, that's not yet the case with nature. We've got the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, sort of coming down the track. The ISSB will at some stage start thinking about nature, but that could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the pipe. So nature is sort of, you know, going to be in the mix. Nutrition is not really being talked about by any of these bodies, partly, as you were sort of suggesting earlier, because the impact is not directly on the planet, it's actually on the people. So we're focused very much on what humanity's doing to its environment rather than what humanity's doing to humanity. But that, I think, will catch up quite quickly, and nutrition is likely to be sort of encapsulated into these systems, but it probably will be the third sort of leg of the stool rather than the second.
There's a kind of a follow-on question, because climate disclosures are becoming mandatory in a number of jurisdictions now. So we've got the CSRD in the EU, which can comply or explain process for your climate disclosures, and then it's happening in other jurisdictions, Japan and the US and others. Do you think that this is something that nutrition should also be looking towards? So you mentioned regulation, but there's also, you mentioned the limitations of regulation, because I'm aware that once they introduced a sugar tax, all the companies just switched to sweetener, which actually has as bad possibly health effects as sugar. So regulation is always going to be kind of running to catch up on that one, as it is in so many spaces. But should there be mandatory nutrition disclosures? I mean, all the food that I have has this little nutrition, which I can't actually read anymore because my eyes are getting so bad, but they all have this on the packet anyway. So is it necessary at an entity level as well?
Yes, I think, well, I think the work the Access to Nutrition Initiative does demonstrates that it's possible to come up with an aggregate score for a company's food product portfolio. And you can sort of go onto their website to look at details, but in essence, they add up the ingredients for individual food products, and then they sales weight the food products, so they're getting a sales weighted sort of aggregate score for the food portfolio. So it's possible. They're doing that from a generally an outside-in perspective, so they're getting other sources of information to understand what a company is doing. It clearly would be technically possible for companies themselves to do this. And that really is the sort of the heart of the information that investors need. They need a score, an assessment of what a company is doing. What proportion of your business is generating money by selling unhealthy products and therefore is at risk from regulation? What proportion is coming from healthy products and therefore potentially actually could be a growth area? That's financially really, really meaningful from an investment perspective.
So there's a few questions in the Q&A now. Some of you kind of accidentally answered. I think one you just accidentally answered is anonymous attendee. I don't know if that's an intentional thing, anonymous attendee, or if it's just something that happens with Zoom. But it says, very interesting presentation. When it comes to regulation, especially for a sector like the food industry, it often relies on research to prove the impact on health for what is good or bad, which often takes decades to get the information. It's a good point. We also see different standards and regulations in different markets, US versus Europe, for example. So how would you look at multinational companies and judge the healthiness of their products? And I think you started to answer that with looking at their portfolio. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, the advantage of looking at the sort of using a health star rating, for example, is you're looking at the individual components of a product. And dairy yogurt drink is a dairy yogurt drink, whether it's sold in the US or sold in Europe. It may be manufactured in a slightly different way. It may have different ingredients, higher levels of sugar in one country and lower in another. But you can take that into account, provided you've got the sort of the information. And generally speaking, if you want to understand what's in a yogurt drink, you go and buy one in a supermarket, take it back to your lab and look at the label or even analyze it. So ultimately, you can do quite a comprehensive outside-in examination of a company's food product portfolio, and then come up with a score which is not affected by different regulations in different countries. And the different regulations generally focus on what you're allowed to put into food or do to it. So can you chlorinate your chicken to make it sort of bug-free, or do you have to sort of grow it in a relatively bug-free way, US versus Europe? And then secondly, what labels do you put on it? So in Chile, you have to put a big sort of black hexagon that says, if you eat this food, it will kill you. And if you eat that food, it won't. You don't have to do that in the UK. You have sort of various voluntary traffic light measures, and the same is true in different European countries. So regulation tends to have a local effect in terms of what goes in and then how you describe it. But something like a health star rating can be applied irrespective of how a food product is being regulated in a particular country. So yes, it works for multinational or sort of domestically focused companies equally well.
There are some more questions in the Q&A, but just a quick question. Is there an international body I know there's the FAO, but that's primarily focused on production. So is there an international body that would have a voice in this to harmonize some of these regulations?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I guess the World Health Authority is the organization that talks about sort of obesity and, dietary effects on social health. So they really are the body that's been primarily responsible for sort of publicizing the effect of diet on health and non-communicable diseases that result from sort of health drivers, if you like. But they're obviously not a sort of a regulatory body. But yeah, I think they would be one of the obvious sort of multinational sort of nodes, if you like, that you might be able to use as a starting point.
Okay. There's a question here. What do you think about the role food retailers and grocers play in increasing access to healthy food, i.e., with the packaging, pricing, and promotion of products? And I will add something to that in addition, because one of the things we know about is food deserts in urban areas, and just the challenge for certain people in certain parts of cities to actually be able to access healthy food. Is there Should this also be reported? Some of these, I mean, it's a retail point of view more than like a Denon point of view, but is there something that the retailers should also be reporting? Like we have our shops in X zone which has no other source of healthy food, for example.
Yes, I think that would be a very interesting sort of detailed level of granular analysis. You certainly potentially want that as a regulator, sort of as a state. Whether investors would find it useful because it would get so detailed so quickly is perhaps sort of a moot point. But I think, yeah, that what is the responsibility? I guess what we talked to a number of investors when we were compiling this report, and one of them used a phrase which I've heard before, but it's a good way of describing it, that we live, certainly in the Western world, in an obesogenic environment. So we live in a food environment which is configured to make us overeat and to overeat the wrong things. So you think about the way things are advertised on sort of TV and social media or whatever. You think about the way they're packaged. So bad food looks very exciting. You think about the way that it's sold in terms of the order in which you meet things in the supermarket or how they appear to you on the high street. I mean, your point about food deserts, parts of the UK where you have to walk 2 miles to get to a supermarket and you'll pass 5 fast food shops on the way. All of these sorts of things. So the food environment in which we live is not helping us to live healthy lives. And there are many, many components to that. So there are the food manufacturers who are making products that are potentially unhealthy. And they tend to say, well, you eat a small amount as part of a healthy diet, knowing full well that the product is configured once you popped open the top of that can and those delicious slices of artificially processed potato, you just got to get to the bottom. You can't resist it. That Neanderthal inside us all goes, I've got to have more chocolate. And particularly if it's then sold on a buy one, get one free basis or this sort of thing, or, you supersize me, get an extra big sort of jar of soft drink at the fast food outlet. All of these things, they're all configured to make us live unhealthy lives rather than healthy ones. So the problem is pretty complicated. There's a really interesting study actually was produced in the UK by a guy called Henry Dimbleby, who's a sort of quite a well-known food expert and has in the past owned a food business, and he helped to develop, or he ran the development of the UK food strategy, which unfortunately was not implemented by the previous government. It's published in 2021. May be adopted by the new government. We don't know, but it really sets out a very, very clear analysis of exactly this problem, that we're living in an obesogenic environment and there are lots and lots of contributing factors. So the retailers have a role to play, definitely. So do fast food outlets, so do food manufacturing companies, so do the sort of the state, the way that it procures food, the food it provides in schools, the food it provides in hospitals, the way that you regulate local planning environments. Again, going back to, do you allow people to set up a burger van outside the school gates, or must it be a celery stall or something like that? All of these things have an impact. So it's a big problem and it needs a sort of holistic solution.
Yeah, I remember that there was a bit of a hoo-ha about that strategy being quietly dropped. I mean, they wanted to drop it quietly and it ended up being dropped quite loudly.
Yeah.
But yes, I do remember that. And I hope it does get picked up again by the new government, because there's so much to do. There's, as you said, there's There's town planning as to where things are allowed to set up, but there's also town planning that would encourage people to walk or
Mm.
cycle, for example, rather
Yep.
than being too scared to get on a bike because there's no safe place to cycle and
Mm.
everything's too far away. There's a couple more questions here. I don't know if we're actually going to have time to get through
Mm.
them all. So, Peter, this presentation was very interesting. What did you see from your research on one, the producers of profitable and unhealthy products transitioning to healthy products? And two, what specialist financing products or structures, if any, they were using to facilitate such a transition?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think in basic terms, we didn't see strong evidence of companies transitioning from sort of one to the other. So, if you pick on the big soft drinks manufacturers, for example, Coca-Cola is really dedicated to soft drinks. Pepsi has taken a slightly more diversified strategy, so it's focused on snacks as well as soft drinks. And some of those snacks are being configured as sort of healthy snacks, but a lot of them are not. But I think if your business is soft drinks, then you can diversify to an extent into sort of maybe flavored water as a healthier alternative. But it's going to be a bit of a challenge unless you really decide to reconfigure your business and do other things as well. So I think in simple terms, no, we're not seeing strong evidence of businesses transitioning. We are seeing quite a lot of evidence of businesses being aware of opportunities to sort of marginally expand their space into healthier food products. And if, as I say, they're already doing a broader range of food products, then adding on an extra sort of, healthy whatever will potentially be sort of easy for them to do. The other thing that we are seeing a trend towards is what is sometimes called nutraceuticals, which is food which is actually configured to have a direct health benefit, like a product like Benecol, for example, which has plant stanols in it. And it's literally just a sort of small yogurt drink shot where you're drinking it for the purpose of reducing your risk of cholesterol rise and therefore heart disease. So it's a sort of looks a bit like a food product, but really it's actually a health product. And companies like Nestle are really beginning to sort of focus on that as an expansion opportunity. So transition, no, I don't think so. Some companies expanding their food portfolios in a healthy direction. Yes, we are seeing some evidence of that. So the answer to your second question, no financial products or structures around facilitating that transition at the moment. Doesn't mean there couldn't be, but nothing being done right now.
I've never heard of a nutraceutical, but would that encompass things like fortified breakfast cereals?
Yes, to an extent it would. I mean, the whole issue of fortification of food, so sort of adding minerals and vitamins, is quite a big sort of quite a big issue from a societal perspective. If you can persuade food companies to sort of add extra good things into a product that consumers are already chomping on, then that can have health benefits. So yeah, putting extra vitamins in your cereals can be good, provided, of course, that they're not completely coated in sugar and sold by some friendly tiger, in which case you may be getting a lot of dental problems in spite of the fact that people can now see in the dark because they got lots of vitamin B in there or whatever. So it can be a mixed blessing. But yeah, fortifying foods is potentially a good thing. Just as an aside, you may be aware there was quite a controversy in, I think, was it Indonesia, but around the golden rice issue.
I was going to mention golden rice,
Yeah,
actually. Yes, that's
which
another
of course
one.
was genetically modified to have beta carotene and vitamin B in it as an example of fortification, but rather adding it in the manufacturing process, you're actually adding it genetically, so it grew in the fields that way. And there was a huge sort of controversy around whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. So it's not a completely simple debate, that one. But yeah, that might be an example again of how a company could try and sort of add a health dynamic to its food product.
There's another one, and this actually touches to a question that's in the chat, which is, it says, question for Rachel. Are there things that you've seen in the climate space that could be looked at to assess the financial materiality of poor nutrition? So there was another rice strain. I don't think it ever was launched, and it's a fairly recent thing, so I don't know if it will get launched. But it was building in protein into the rice. So when you eat rice, you also get the protein that you need. And I think it was bringing in some form of cultured animal protein. So this, as both Peter and I have mentioned over this past hour, producing livestock is the single kind of most negatively impactful thing you can do from a climate and environment point of view. Because, producing livestock, and particularly in intensive farming, because you have to grow the food, it has very significant land use change implications, it uses enormous amounts of water and creates enormous amounts of waste. So there's some efforts now to biofortify food products with cell-cultured meat to both tackle poor nutrition and some of the environmental externalities associated with livestock. But generally, when you say poor, this question talks about poor nutrition. So it's a challenging area to talk about, because as Peter said, there's poor nutrition from the point of view of eating, for example, heavily processed food, or too much salt and too much sugar. So that's poor nutrition. There's also poor nutrition from eating high quantities of red meat, for example, which has been linked to cancer and various other diseases. But then there's also poor nutrition from not having enough of any of these things. So you really can't talk about poor nutrition in a very simple way. It has to be a fairly holistic way. And there's an ongoing study at the moment, which is the Eat Lancet 2.0. And the purpose of this very large research project is to try to define what a healthy diet looks like and how it could be produced that stays within these planetary boundaries. So the planetary boundaries were defined quite a long time ago now. I remember having conversations about them about 15 years ago. I can't remember when the paper actually came out, but these planetary boundaries say, they talk about climate, biodiversity, pollution, water use, and various other things. And agriculture affects how close we are to exceeding these planetary boundaries and damaging our environment beyond beyond repair almost. Now, Eat Lancet is looking at these planetary boundaries and looking at what this means in terms of how much you can produce of different foods and how much each person on this planet needs to eat on a daily basis to stay healthy, and what types of food they need to eat to stay healthy, and how we can do that staying within these various planetary boundaries. So for the person who asked the question about climate, space, and poor nutrition, it doesn't directly touch on the financial materiality of that, because Peter did talk about the financial materiality of poor nutrition earlier, with days off sick, for example, and very heavy burdens on the state, as well as on companies who lose their workforce. But I would suggest people go and have a look at the Eat Lancet 2.0 research piece to understand a bit more about the interaction of these areas. Now, I think we've got 2 minutes left, and my clock is always running fast, so I'm not entirely sure. But one last question to throw at you, Peter, because there is one that we didn't get to at the bottom. A general question: to what extent should and can nutrition be posed as an investment opportunity versus a financial risk? So if you can say something about that in 60 seconds or less, that would be wonderful.
I think the risks are very obvious. I think if you are a company which is dedicated to producing unhealthy food, I think you are very clearly in the sort of regulators' crosshairs, and they will be coming for that sort of behaviour, and that will have a very strong negative impact on your business, whether it be by raising your costs, by preventing you from sort of expanding the volumes you sell, or simply from banning the product completely. So there's a very clear investment risk. I think the investment opportunities are much more varied. We talked about nutraceuticals, so actually producing things that look a bit like food but are really dedicated to health benefits. Rachel's touched on the issue of sort of, alternative proteins, whether that be plant-based substitutes for meat, so your sort of vegan sausage, or lab-grown meat, where you're actually eating a chicken but it grew in a lab rather than an egg, or it's some sort of tofu alternative where it's a fermentation-based sort of technology, or a mixture of all of these things. There are huge opportunities with that, and we could really spend the rest of the week talking about alternative proteins because it's a massive field. But that's an enormous opportunity. And going back to Rachel's point, there is a huge opportunity to generate food with a much, much smaller land footprint, and therefore a much lighter footprint from a climate and nature perspective. And that's the real challenge, I think, from a food system as a whole, that it has a massively negative sort of impact on our climate, our environment, and on the people that it's supposed to be feeding at the moment. But it could be a huge positive lever for change. And that's really what we need to see.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Peter, and for educating
My
me
pleasure.
about nutrition and the Health Star system, which I also didn't know about. So this is great. We've had some fantastic questions, and I will say thank you very much to all of the people who joined us today. As I said, our Lunch and Learns are an ongoing kind of series of webinars where we invite someone to present some recent interesting work that they've done generally in the finance space, the sustainable finance space. And I look forward to seeing everybody at the next one. But Peter, again, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge on this. It was fantastic to have you with us again to have another conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. So with that, I will see you next time.